So thank you for introducing me, George. Yes, my name is Claire Lester, and I'm a lecturer in the department here. Unfortunately, Michael, the co-author for this paper, was unable to join today, so I'm presenting on the both of us. The title of our paper being From Dependency to Decoloniality, the Enduring Relevance of Materialist Political Economy and the Problems of a Decolonial Alternative. So in a nutshell, the paper is a critique of decolonial theory that was powered by placing the former into critical dialogue with another tradition in radical political economic thought, namely dependency theory or the dependency tradition. At a basic level, we thought both dependency and decoloniality really have decolonization as their central objectives. At a very high level of generality, both insist that certain power dynamics in the world system deliberately constrain prospects for social emancipation. But they disagree quite fundamentally on a number of salient points, including how these constraints are to be understood and what social emancipation or decolonization, in fact, actually involves. Dependency theory confronted its central problem to be underdevelopment. Underdevelopment as a consequence of neocolonialism and imperialism that reproduced core periphery dynamics, with the developed core nations engaging in relations of extraction and exploitation of the periphery states, buttressed by unequal division of labor in the world economy. For dependency theorists, to escape underdevelopment is not, as some might argue, including decolonial theorists, just a matter of economics or economic development, narrowly defined, but a broader project of social development and self-determination. Because decolonial theorists tend to come from Latin America, and because the starting point of both traditions appear quite similar, it's common to maintain that decolonial theory is, in a sense, an outgrowth of the dependency tradition. One of our goals of the paper is to complicate this idea. And we suggest instead that these two traditions stem from quite disparate intellectual traditions, whereas the dependency tradition can be seen as a variant, even if radical variant, of classical and Marxist political economy and Enlightenment thought broadly defined. We trace the decolonial tradition's intellectual genealogy to anti-modernist, counter-Enlightenment and culturalist thought, which also is a strong representation in the European tradition. So in the paper, we argue that it's useful to situate decolonial theory within the cultural turn in social theory that took place in the 1970s, which interestingly grew out of Marxist historiography to bring culture back in and add texture to understandings of class formation and political action. However, soon, when fused with aspects of post-colonial theory, social theorists began to argue within this cultural turn that economic structure was itself a product of culture. Here, the focal point of analysis in radical social theory shifts from the study of underdevelopment and a materialist analysis of global capitalism to an analysis of frames of meaning, discourses, cultural imperialism, and epistemic structures of domination. We define decolonial theory in the paper as a research program, and reading its key theorists such as Quijano, Mignolo, and Ndlovu-Gatsheni, we outline what we see as a core set of hypotheses of the decolonial research program. These are A, that the fundamental constraints to development are rooted in knowledge and culture, and B, that colonial relations of power persist due to the domination and penetration of Eurocentric forms of knowledge and culture. Decoloniality, as argued by Gross-Fogel, involves the subordination of all social relations and social action to the domain of knowledge and culture, and the rejection of allegedly Eurocentric forms of knowledge that are responsible for the phenomena of neocolonialism, imperialism, and development. A quote that captures this by Ndlovu-Gatsheni is the following, quote, "The modern world system is an epistemic creation, and its shifting global orders are epistemic creations. By that same logic, what exists as economy, society, and politics are all epistemic creations. What is termed development is also an epistemic creation." That's from his book, Decolonization, Development, and Knowledge in Africa. So what do we find problematic about this? One of the goals of the paper, as I said, was to place decoloniality and dependency theory in conversation with one another. And we do this by placing two African exponents of each tradition in conversation. These are Samir Amin, who was mentioned, an African political theorist known for his establishment of Cardesria and his critique of Eurocentrism, and then Sabelo J, who we argue brings decoloniality to an African context, arguing that Africa's failure to develop is due to its rootedness in a colonial matrix of power. While Ndlovu-Gatsheni has tried to claim Amin and various others as decolonial theorists, we argue that Amin would have been quite critical of the decolonial tradition, which becomes clear through his writing, particularly through reading his book, Eurocentrism. Amin wrote this book to contest Edward Said's argument in Orientalism and more generally post-colonial thought at the time, which had become increasingly popular. That argument was that imperialism and colonialism were rooted in a cultural bias in Western culture writ large. Amin criticized culturalism, stating that it commits to dubious essentialism, associating distinct cultures with enduring characteristics that predispose certain cultures to certain kinds of actions, like colonialism. But we argue that it's impossible to maintain a coherent and stable notion of ideas like the West or Western thought or even European culture. This essentialism generates analytic and political disabilities. Analytically, we really can't make reference to such an ill-defined concept like Western knowledge to understand the drivers of past and present forms of imperialism or underdevelopment, or that challenging Eurocentric epistemic bias should be at the foreground of resistance to coloniality. Politically, if we accept that all action is determined by culture or a particular episteme or way of being, then the fact of global cultural epistemic variance undermines the claim that there is such thing as a universal basis for social action. As many other articles in the special issue discuss, this can also serve as a justification to support nationalist, chauvinist, and far-right political movements in the global south. This is particularly the case if we continue to associate the West with modernity, cosmopolitanism, and universalism. Samir Amin set out to challenge an attack on the Enlightenment and modernity, a process which he saw as universal and not in any way monopolized by Europe or the West. We think that his effort was a success. We also find that practical, concrete proposals for African decolonization to be wanting within decoloniality theory. A key concept invoked is that of delinking, but while Amin spoke of the global south economically delinking from the global north within the dependency tradition, Mignolo argues for epistemic delinking from imperial and colonial mindsets of coloniality. One ought to delink from ideas related to modernity, including the Enlightenment, due to their connection to European and colonial epistemologies. We find a contradictory injunction for decolonial thinking, which is to engage pluriversality as a universal project, which is from Mignolo. Pluriversality meaning moving away from hierarchies of knowledge to, quote, a world where many worlds live unhierarchized. That's from Gatsheni. However, we find some contradictions, as in another instance, there is clear emphasis on the centering of knowledges of, quote, Black and Indigenous peoples to lead decolonial scholarship, which then suggests some kind of hierarchy of knowledge. And of course, the task of epistemic delinking is made far more complicated when one considers that the ideas of, quote, Black and Indigenous peoples are not only diverse, but sometimes involve embracing universality and modernity, as Samir Amin shows us. So to conclude, I think we should stress once more that the article is supportive of the aim to decolonize. We also agree that epistemic injustice is real and has real and debilitating effects in various areas of social and intellectual life, but simply disagree with the culturalist framing of the issue by prominent decolonial theorists. We agree with Amin that culturalism can serve to lubricate rather a politics of conservative and romantic nostalgia. Finally, we do not simply think that a return to the dependency tradition is what we need, and instead a lot of the articles about revealing some of the weaknesses in prominent strands of dependency theory as well. Nonetheless, we write that the rational core of dependency tradition in Amin's work is laudable. And so for decolonization to be involved, we maintain it requires a materialist critique of global capitalism, and we also maintain that it can and should be guided by universalist ethics.